Women and politics. When I say women in politics, what I'm referring to is the early women's rights movement, also referred to as the first wave movement and the women's suffrage movement. In this lecture, I want you to be able to explain the early women's rights movement. In order to discuss the women's rights movement, we have to go back into the early 1800s. The ideology during the early 1800s and into the mid and late 1800s is that women and men had separate spheres. In other words, men and women had separate roles in society. The woman's sphere was that her place was in the home, in the kitchen, raising children. She had to be moral, pure, ethical. Women were considered the moral compasses of society. Opposite to men, who were considered brutish characters. So the women were there to kind of curve those brutish tendencies of men. Speaking in public was indecent for women, and being in public without an escort was indecent. What I mean by that is a male escort, not a prostitute male escort, but just a male in general. If you ever watch those old movies and you see women being escorted down the street by a man, and that's representative of what I'm talking about. If women were out after hours, it was seen as indecent. What is she doing after hours? Is she doing immoral things? Men's sphere was that they were involved in economics, they were involved in war type activity, the professions, business, and so forth. And they were not expected to be the moral counterparts to women. It was the opposite, as I just said. Men were also involved in various activities and in politics. So, what rights did women have in the early part of the 19th century? Well, not very many. For example, married women couldn't own or inherit property. Married women were the property of their husbands. Husbands, by law, were entitled to their wives' wages and bodies. Women had no rights to serve on a jury. They were considered incompetent to testify. And of course, they had no right to vote. Their vote was counted as their husband's vote. Women had no rights to their children. So if a woman were to leave her husband, then she would have to leave without her children. Women had no opportunities to go to college or be in the professions. No rights to sign contracts. So part of the problem here is if women were involved in domestic issues with their husbands, if their husbands were beating them or treating them poorly, they really didn't have a lot of options. If they chose to leave their husband, they would basically leave with the clothes on their backs and without their children. Women and the abolitionist movement. Before the women's rights movement starts, we have the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement is a movement to end slavery. Much of this movement took place in the North, and it was supported by blacks, free blacks, and also by whites. It was mostly driven by blacks, but there were white advocates. And primarily, those white advocates were middle class. And there were many women abolitionists. The abolitionists would meet at people's houses, they would have speeches, they would write articles, and were often subjected to violence by those who opposed abolition. So many of these women's rights advocates will be a part of the abolitionist movement first, which at that time was considered indecent to be involved in politics, to be out giving speeches. You will have all kinds of women speaking. You will have African American women who will address both white and black audiences. So the abolitionist movement will influence the women's rights movement because many women saw themselves as having something in common with slaves. They saw themselves as being oppressed or by their husband or being a slave to their husband. Now, of course, their position and being a slave are two different things, but that's the way they viewed it. So both abolitionist advocates and women's rights advocates will really advocate or promote universal rights or human rights. They saw both women and slaves needing both, right? Universal and human rights. You will have people like Frederick Douglass, who is a very strong leader of the abolition movement, also be involved in the women's rights movement. So many of the strategies of the women's rights movement will be taken in part, at least, from the abolitionist movement, such as having meetings, writing articles, giving speeches, and so forth. Temperance movement occurs in the 1830s. And temperance was about promoting sobriety and clean living. It was about limiting alcohol. Alcohol was the cause of the social problems. Temperance advocates would say that men needed to stop drinking up the family income. They would go to work, go to the tavern, spend all their earned money on alcohol, and then oftentimes go home and beat their wife. And there was a lot of domestic violence problems going on at the time. So many temperance advocates felt that these problems were being caused by alcohol. Temperance also included cleaning up prostitution or getting rid of prostitution because they considered it to be immoral. Prostitution was not legal, but it was tolerated. It was also often delegated to the what they called red light districts, kind of off away from the town, so to speak, or in a certain part of town. So many advocates of the abolition movement will also be advocates of the temperance movement. And they will also be advocates of the women's rights movement. So there is an influence of change here. There's a reason historians called this the Age of Reform. It's because there's a lot of reform movements going on. Abolition, temperance, and then women's rights. And all of these movements were influencing each other. The women's rights movement was also influenced by the Second Great Awakening. Some of you who have had 101, History 101, may have already talked about the Second Great Awakening. I'm not going to go into it in depthly. I'm just going to go into it just briefly here. The Second Great Awakening was kind of this spiritual rebirth. It was about evangelical preaching, about emotional and passionate preaching. So, what the Second Awakening does for the women's rights movement and to other movements is it influences people's way of thinking. That suddenly there was something wrong with slavery. It was immoral. That something was wrong with the way prisoners were being treated. Something was wrong with the way women were being treated. So it was kind of this spiritual awakening to social issues as well. It became really about human rights and human dignity. Okay. So the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement was primarily headed up by two main individuals. There were many women's advocates, but these two women really paved the way for women's rights. This woman is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this woman is Susan B. Anthony. And what the movement was about was improving the lives of women, addressing domestic violence, addressing prison conditions, and then later addressing workers' issues. They will eventually promote an 8-hour workday. 8-hour workday. They will advocate for the abolishment of child labor. They will be anti-prostitution. And ultimately, they will advocate for women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was middle class. She was college educated. She was a married mother of 7. And she was an abolitionist. In fact, she was married to an abolitionist. Susan B. Anthony was a Quaker. She was also middle class. She was single, no children, and she was an abolitionist. She refused to get married until women had the right to vote. So she will never get married, and she will never have children. What's interesting here is the fact that she was a Quaker. Quakers were also often passive, very passive people, but they did promote women's leadership, women's religious leadership in their way of life. So it's almost fitting that she would be a part of this movement for women. Other advocates were Lucy Burns and Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a former slave. And both of these women were also abolitionists. In 1848, the women's rights movement held its first convention in Seneca Falls, New York. One of the founders of that convention was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. During that convention, she gave a speech. And in that speech, she cited the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. Except she inserted the words, "All women are created equal." And she will go on to say in that speech that women should have the right to vote. Now, this was considered a very radical speech for its time. First of all, you have a woman standing up in a public forum discussing politics. But then to state that women should have the right to vote was even a more radical step. After this convention, she will meet up with Susan B. Anthony, and they will collaborate on moving the women's rights movement forward. Elizabeth Cady Stanton will do a lot of the writing, particularly because she has children at home and can't travel as much. And Susan B. Anthony will do a lot of the giving of speeches in various parts of the country. One of the things that they do is to try to get the women's right to vote through the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was an amendment that occurred during the Reconstruction era, and it defined citizenship. But what it really defined was citizenship with respect to voting for men. So it doesn't say anything about voting for either African Americans or for women. But the women's rights movement will try to challenge that and try to get the right to vote through the 14th Amendment. And they're not successful at that. In fact, Susan B. Anthony will try to get arrested. And she does get arrested a time or two. And one of the problems was that they didn't want to arrest her because she was a woman, and that just simply looked bad. But she wanted to get arrested, and the reason she got arrested was because she tried to vote. And oftentimes, one way to make a change is to actually commit the crime or commits an act that was illegal, and then try to get it changed in the court system. And that's what they were trying to do. But they weren't successful at challenging the 14th Amendment. Also during Reconstruction, we will have the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. It was intended for the freedmen or the former slaves, and it gave African American men the right to vote. But the women's rights movement wanted sex added in to the amendment. So not only should blacks get the right to vote, but women should get the right to vote as well. And one of their arguments is that it's very kind of racist in nature, because what they'll say is, well, look, we are these middle class white educated women, and we can't vote, but these what we deemed as inferior black men can vote. So they will try to challenge it in that way. But they will get in an argument with the abolitionist. And in fact, this will split the women's rights movement away from the abolitionist movement. Because up until this point, they had been working together. But over the 15th Amendment, they will split. Frederick Douglass will say, look, women's rights needed to take a back seat to blacks getting the right to vote, that it was more important for blacks to get the right to vote than it was for women, at least at that time. It's not that women shouldn't get the right to vote, but they needed to take a back seat at that point, because they felt like if they added sex to the 15th Amendment, then it would tank the 15th Amendment, and then blacks would not get the right to vote. So they will split on this issue, and in fact, the movement itself will split into the American Women's Suffrage Association. It will be led by Lucy Stone, whom I mentioned earlier, and then the National Women's Suffrage Association, which will be led by Stanton and Anthony. So both of these associations will really be fighting for the same things, except the National Women's Suffrage Association will really focus on women's suffrage. By the 1890s, there will be progress for women. Women will start to attend college, and in some states, there will even be co-education. Women will gain property rights They could sue, they could testify, they could serve as jurors and lawyers. But this wasn't nationally, this was in particular states. But it was progress. Because what these women did was they went from state to state and tried to get state laws, at least. And so they were somewhat successful in that regard. And they will also get the right to vote in 4 states, which were Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. But they were always concerned that this progress that they made in these states wouldn't hold because it was a state law. And if you want something more steady or solid, you really need a national law. So ultimately, what they decided was that they needed to get an amendment to the Constitution. That they tried it through the 14th Amendment, they tried to get it through the 15th Amendment, neither of those worked, so they needed an amendment of their own. So that's what the main focus is going to be, primarily amongst Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Now, even though this started as a middle-class white women's movement, it will welcome black women and immigrants eventually. There will be a bit of a rift, particularly with black women, and they won't be as welcomed into the movement as much as they should have been. What will happen is the movement was knew that they wanted to get an amendment to the Constitution to get the women's right to vote. And in order to do that, they needed the southern states. And during this time, the southern states were in post-Reconstruction. A lot of discrimination and violence towards blacks were taking place. So they felt if they invited black women into the movement, then they may lose the support of these southern states. But the black women did not care, and they will march and demonstrate and do all the same things to promote women's rights for themselves and for others. With respect to immigrants, there's a little bit of a backlash with immigrant women. Part of the problem is that one of the things that they wanted to do was to what they deemed as protecting women in the factories, that they wanted shorter work days and a less child labor or no child labor. But the problem with that is that with immigrants, that's how they supported themselves. The entire family would work in these factories. And if you shorten the days, that meant less money for the family. So their needs was not necessarily in line with the needs of these middle class women who did rely on wage work. But in the end, they all worked together to gain the right to vote. This is a film I'm going to put a link on Canvas to that I would like you to watch. It's optional. I'm not going to test you on it, but I will put it on Canvas for you. It talks about the latter part of the women's rights movement. Ultimately, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association will get back together, and they will move forward with the women's right to vote. They will also join up with what's called the WTCU, or the Women's Temperance Christian Union. This is the second temperance movement. It happens in the latter part of the 19th century, and it really wanted the same things as the 1830s temperance movement. They were still working on that, except by this time we'd gone through industrialization and their focus had broadened to protecting children, protecting women, and so forth. And they will ally with the rest of the women's rights movement to try to get the right to vote. Because what these women recognized, even though they came from different socioeconomic environments, they were different ethnicities, had different viewpoints. One thing that they had in common is they couldn't put forth those viewpoints if they didn't have political power. They couldn't make the changes that they wanted in the law if they didn't have political power. So the commonality between all of them was having political power, and political power came through voting. By the time we reach the 1900s, the methods for achieving women's rights will change to some degree. And what I mean by that is that early on, you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing speeches, you had Susan B. Anthony out getting speeches, getting the law changed. But these methods will become more blatant. They will become a lot more in your face. They will hold these flamboyant parades. They will demonstrate at Wilson's inauguration. They will have hunger strikes. They will go to jail. It becomes a lot more vocal. And understand, not everybody wanted this movement. There was even a number of women that were not necessarily in favor of the women's rights movement. And part of the reason with respect to women was because they worried that they were going to have to start acting like men, that they were going to have the sole responsibility for the family. And they were very uncomfortable with that. And of course, a number of men didn't want it because they didn't think that women should have the right to vote, and also because they were afraid of what the women would do with that political power, particularly the temperance women, meaning there was a lot of tavern owners that made their living from selling alcohol to men, and they worried if women got the power to vote, then they would get rid of the alcohol. And in fact, that is exactly what happens. And not long after they get the right to vote, spoiler alert, they get the right to vote, prohibition will happen shortly thereafter. It goes away, but it does happen. And most of this movement is going to be carried on by the younger generation, particularly Cady Stanton's daughter. She will be a very prominent member, prominent leader in this movement, moving into the 1900s. And by the early 1900s, rather, Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony will pass away. So they ultimately never get to see the fruits of their movement. They'll never get to vote themselves. And then ultimately, in 1920, women will get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And the amendment really came in by the skin of its teeth, by one vote. And it's rumored that that vote happened because the gentleman's mother told him to vote for it. Now, whether that's exactly true or not, we don't really know, but That was always the rumor. But it came in really by the skin of its teeth. And so, as of 1920, women had the right to vote. And that really ends the first wave part of the women's rights movement. We will talk about the second wave a little bit later in the 1950s and the 1960s. Okay, that ends this lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.